Good evening, ladies and gentlemen. I'm Uri Dromi. I'm the director of the Jerusalem Press Club. Welcome. Former Deputy Prime Minister, Chairman of JPC, Jerusalem Press Club, Mr. Dan Meridor, Dr. Andor Noj, Hungarian Ambassador in Israel, Köszönöm, hogy ma tetszett jönni. Ladies and gentlemen, good evening. Few housekeeping remarks. First of all, be kind, switch your cell phones to silent mode. If not, switch them altogether. Then, welcome to our friends, many friends who are watching us now through the application. You can download it yourself. And it allows you to stay digitally connected to our conference. It's JPC Freedom. And also look at the hashtag over there of the conference, it's JPC Press Freedom. This is the second international conference on the freedom of the press that we are holding. This time it's titled Press Freedom in the Digital Era. A word about our press club, since its establishment in 2013 by the Jerusalem Foundation, the Jerusalem Press Club has invested its effort in four main tracks. One, becoming home away from home for the Foreign Press Corps based in Israel and for visiting journalists. And indeed, we have more than 500 registered members worldwide. And those of you who are not members yet, this is your golden opportunity to grab our able staff here. Second thing, inviting journalists who cover areas where Israel has something interesting to say to the world, like science, high tech, film, music, etc. Third thing is investing in the next generation of journalists, inviting graduate journalism students to come here and be impressed with how complex the situation here is. Last but not least, promoting the freedom of the press, and this conference is the highlight of this activity. JPC is a proud member of the International Association of Press Clubs and the European Federation of Press Clubs, and I extend warm welcome to our friends here from Geneva, Guy Metin. Just mention, show people that you are here. He's the Executive Director of Press Club of Geneva, and he's the President for this year of both the International Association and the European Federation. We have from Brussels, the President of the Press Club, Maroun Labaki, over there, and the CEO of the Press Club, Brussels, Europe. They have a great location. They are located across the street from NATO and the EU. So everybody comes to them. We need to bring people over. And treat him with respect because he's the president of this year. Warsaw, our good friend Jaroslav Lodarczyk, over there, is president of Press Club Polska. And from Belarus, Alexandra Gubskaya over there. Thanks for coming, Press Club Belarus. From New York, Didier Debke, the elected president of OPC, Overseas Press Club of America over there. And Patricia Krantz, CEO of the Overseas Press Club of America, came all the way from New York. From Kosovo, Karim Ondozi, Press Council of Kosovo over there. And from Spain and Latin America, Rafael Anibal and Daniela Benaim, Fuente Latina. I will mention some more names later, also during dinner. Before I continue, before I finish, I want to thank the able staff of the Jerusalem Press Club, who worked day and night to make this happen, primarily to my deputy, Vanessa Kaczynski. She deserves applause here. together with Raya Koval-Umansky over there. She's very modest, but she deserves a lot of applause as well. Itzi Kushel, Tal Buchni, Yael Kessler, Shlomi, Shaked Sapir, Katie, Nofar Winter. Have I omitted somebody? No, this is the first time I'm doing things right. And many thanks to Mishkenot Sha'ananim for hosting us, Director Moti Schwartz and Director of the Guest House, Rita Kramer. Now it's my honor and pleasure to introduce Dan Meridor, former Deputy Prime Minister and Chairman of the Board of the Jerusalem Press Club, to say a few words of greetings. And you can clap.
Good evening, Erev Tov. Bonne soirée, c'est que je venais de Genève, de Paris et de Bruxelles. I'm sorry, I can't say it in Hungarian. I don't know how to do it. Dobry wieczór to those who came from Russia and Poland, Belarus. Freedom of the press. If a country has regular elections, honest and proper, and have an independent judiciary, but has no freedom of the press, it's not a democracy. It's an essential principle without which democracy cannot function. And we live in an era that democracy and freedom of the press are under attack, are challenged. I would say that if you look around the world, one can say with some perspective that after the horrors of the Second World War, from 1945 on, we saw a movement towards democracy, human rights, rule of law in Europe and all over the world. There were ups and downs, but basically this was the trend. This was the discourse. Everybody agreed about this. In recent years, I believe we see a backlash. And the horrors of extreme nationalism and fanatic religion and authoritarian regimes might have been forgotten. And one looks at some countries in Europe and some parties in Europe, things that are changing there in the wrong direction, may I say, are very clear. One looks at Turkey, one looks at Eastern European countries, some of them who have gone from communism to democracy are receding. And even in my own country, legislation like nation-state legislation of yesterday and some other pieces of legislation, rhetoric, all this cannot be overlooked. One sees a trend that tilts the pendulum away from the trend that we have seen for many decades. And if we want to preserve our way of life, which are based on principles of liberty, including freedom of the press, we need to do something about it. In that spirit, I think that it's very important that we all gather here, that you all gather here, and discuss whatever is to be discussed in relation with freedom of the press. The other thing I want to mention is that as the world is changing very rapidly, and technology is changing it very rapidly, there is a big question mark about the definition of the role of the press. Press used to be the medium, the intermediary that brought people the news. And in all these countries of democracy in modern time, there was a layer in between the leader and the people, a layer of parliamentarians, of professionals, of journalists. It was not leader and people. They were intermediaries that are essential for democracy to function. In recent years, we see anger, despise, envy at those elites to dry the swamp who need the journalists who are the enemies of the people in several countries. A dangerous trend. So the role of journalists as part of those who function in democracy becomes again challenged and under attack. In a parallel line, because of technology, today people say, who needs the press? the leader or the leaders or the contenders can talk directly to the people, tweet to them, speak on Facebook. They don't need to answer questions. They don't need the press. And if you talk to everybody, not through any layer in between, the talk is short and shallow and emotional. Reason doesn't guide it. So it's even more important to think and discuss the role of the press in democracy and how it continues to function to defend those basic values and way of life that we lead. In that spirit of challenge, let me welcome all of you here in Jerusalem and wish you a good and fruitful conference. Thank you.
Thank you, Dan. Dan sounds like a voice from the past, but I see a future for him as well. So if it happens, remember it started here. Okay, thank you very much. And while in the conference, don't miss the opportunity to look at the exhibition outdoors, exhibition of cartoons done by Israeli high school students, inspired by our previous conference when we heard the journalists from Charlie Hebdo talking about the culture or the political culture of the French magazines and the caricature, and the idea came out to run a competition among high school students, and you see the result. I think it's sometimes unbelievable to realize that these are 13 to 17-year-old kids with such deep ideas and such an artistic skill. So watch it. And now I want to just to say that we're grateful to the Israeli organization who worked with us, Israel Democracy Institute, international, I can't say the name, IDC Herzliya. It's international, interdisciplinary center. IDC, as I said. Thank you, and especially the School of Communications. We have a long collaboration with them. The Israeli Journalists Association, the Jerusalem Journalists Association, IBA, Ministry of Foreign Affairs, Shalom Hartman Institute, and others. And now it's my pleasure to introduce Nitzan Chen, Director of the Government Press Office, GPO. Mr. Chen is a journalist, author, and also served as the chairman of the Israel Broadcasting Authority. Nitzan, please.
Toda Rabba. Good evening, distinguished guests, Mr. Dan Meridor, member of the Knesset, Ksenia Svetlova, ladies and gentlemen, fellow journalists, my friends. I am delighted to be here at this gathering of top-notch leading journalists, all of whom have spearheaded the quest for information over the years. Standing here today, I would like to take this opportunity to stress that Israel strives to be a beacon of free press in the Western world, and especially in the Middle East. As a director of the Government Press Office, we try to nurture our relationship with our foreign press to enable them to receive as much information as possible, to give them a clear, objective point of view. As you know, I'm not from the UN, and I want to project Israel in a fair and honest way. My job, part of my job, is to protect transparency and accuracy in the press, and I really do think that despite all the difficulties facing the state of Israel and our neighbors, our media and press outlets retain their critical independence, and that it's something we hold very dear. And we are not doing such a bad job. This is not easy, especially taking into account advanced in technology and the spread of social media, which have had far-reaching ramifications on our lives, influencing the way we are communicate with each other to the way we shop. The new era of digital and internet communication means that we are constantly looking for a new and innovative ways to gather information, and our readers have become our reporters, living to instant information, which has its advantage and disadvantages. Therefore, the way we collect and process and indeed read our news has changed. Today, as Dan Meridor mentioned, any person armed with smartphone has become a frontline reporter and has the opportunity to collect, analyze, and maybe even more importantly, edit news data. And the age-old dominance of the traditional news outlets has given way. We can see everywhere that it has become difficult for us to distinguish between fake news and responsible journalism, and the public's ability to digest a text longer than 140 characters has been eroded. Moreover, when our world leaders resort to Twitter to inform us what their policy decisions, it is a challenge to gather details and comprehensive information which isn't open to random speculation. The test, therefore, lies in enhancing these new technological innovations and utilizing other technology to deal with the challenges awaiting us while all the time keeping our critical independence. And I'm telling you, as a government of press office, we are dealing now with the Donald Trump too, and I can see all the journalists that's supposed to come, hundreds of journalists, they look at Israel as a democracy country with freedom of speech, freedom of journalism, freedom of access to all regions and all places. And I know sometimes there is some difficulties and we need to solve them in a much effective way. But the bottom line is that all of these topics will be discussed at this gathering of talented and dedicated journalists, and I feel sure that we will together find some insightful answers. So thank you very much for the Jerusalem Press Club, and especially for Uri and for Vanessa for hosting this terrific event, and I wish you all a very fruitful few days. Toda Rabba.
Thank you, Nitzan. I don't envy you. When I ran the GPO 25 years ago, it was much simpler. But carry on with a good job. And now it's my, just a reminder, outside near the lobby of Mishkenot, you'll see a station of Showbox, which is a free online video creation platform that allows you to create high quality professional videos using your own video content. So don't miss the opportunity to go there, record yourself. Some of our speakers already recorded themselves, and then they added whatever they wanted to add as a background, and you get a video clip just like that. So use it. And now it's my pleasure to invite member of the Knesset, Ksenia Svetlova, who is the chairperson of the Knesset Caucus on Press Freedom. Ms. Svetlova is associate professor at the Hebrew University of Jerusalem and policy fellow at the Israeli Institute for Regional Foreign Policies. Ms. Svetlova, please.
Thank you so much, Uri, and thank you for the Press Club for having me here. It's a rare opportunity to meet so many distinguished journalists and colleagues, I should say former colleagues, unfortunately with deep grief. because I spent 14 years of my life as being a journalist, and this is the only dream that I actually pursued, in my childhood and adulthood. So I left it for the sake of no less a noble thing, which is called politics, and much tougher, much more difficult. I should say that in anything that I did in being in my capacities as a journalist. You know that President of the United States, Ronald Reagan, used to collect the Soviet jokes. Actually, he had a bunch of them, and some of it available on the YouTube, so you can all enjoy. But also the Soviet leaders used to pick some jokes about the Americans, of course, and try to return with the same coin. So one of them was told at some point by Leonid Brezhnev in just the beginning of the rule of Ronald Reagan in 81. So the joke goes like this. The American and the Soviet meet and they discuss the freedom of speech. The American says, "We have the best freedom of speech in the world. I can go to the White House right now and say that Ronald Reagan is a dog." And so the Soviet guy looks at him and says, "Well, this is nothing. I can go now to the Red Square and shout that Reagan is a dog." So, all right, no offense to Americans here in the studio. So it seems to me, with all of your optimism, which I admire really, Nitzan, it seems to me that we in Israel are getting there. Not only in Israel, the situation is tough. I understand you. I had to break, this row of optimism with some, political realism. So it seems to me that because the technologies develop so quickly and the media market changes. First of all, the commercial media market is changing so quickly. The news organizations become weaker than they ever used to be before. The weakness of news organizations bring us to a very simple understanding that they are much more prone to litigation. So they are not able to stand in courts anymore and risk spending a lot of money for defending themselves. So we experienced such a fashion here in Israel. In the last year, few journalists, some of them independent journalists, but some of them are not, were targeted by very severe court cases. One of these journalists is Igal Sarna, the top journalist for the Idiot Achronot. Another one is Sharon Sporer, the independent journalist that is now facing the suit for millions of shekels. And basically, when I speak to editors and editors-in-chief, all of them say off the record that, we have to consider that we will have to, in any case, we can face severe courts. And if until very recently it was something that we thought that, the prime minister will not be able, he will not dare to target journalists, then yes, he can. And he does. So we are speaking about the weakness, of course, the financial issue is important here. And second of all, in Israel, we do face interference in the affairs of journalists and journalism and freedom of speech by the government, specifically by the ruling coalition. So this is something that it makes the life of independent journalism, investigative journalists, serious journalists very, very difficult. And I can tell you that in regards to what is happening in the United States, the freedom of speech is not a part of the basic laws here. It's every time we talk about freedom of speech and freedom of journalism, we still rely to the court of 1953 by Kol Ha'am, Bagatz Neged Kol Ha'am. Many years passed, but the legislation that will actually enshrine this basic privilege of the freedom of speech and freedom of journalism is the basic law of Israel. It's still not possible to pass it on. And I made this attempt last year in the Knesset. So this is something that is, of course, puts a lot of questions into future of journalism. And with the statements that we hear from the top ministers in our government, such as Miri Regev, that recently said that, why do we need the new broadcast corporation if we cannot control it? Well, I ask you really, why do we need it? Why does the government need it? They represent the majority, so they want to control the media for the majority, for the sake of the majority, okay? So, of course, I think that the issue such as the freedom of press is being in jeopardy here right now. And the task to explain the necessity in the digital era is indeed very, very difficult. So some of the Knesset members, some of the government members prematurely already said goodbye to investigative journalists, to the journalism in general, relying on the news media, to Twitter, Facebook, to continue to develop and to serve their needs. But what did they do? They did not take into consideration. Who, for now, produced already, like France, went to the direction of government supporting the traditional media. But for that, we need to ensure that the government will not interfere in the affairs of the media. So for us in Israel, I would rather prefer, I'm not a journalist right now, but if I would be, I would say I would prefer to starve than have any shekel from the official authorities. Okay, so in this regard, we are talking about Israeli market, which is very, very small. Media here needs protection, perhaps more than in larger countries, in larger markets. And the battle is fierce. The battle of the powers of the market and the powers of the traditional journalists with all of the values, it's very, very fierce. It needs help. It needs help in legislation. It needs help in the, I'm finishing already, in the civil society. It needs help from everybody who is ready to help. And I think that the future is with journalists and with journalism. There is no replacement. And I can tell you, as somebody who just ceased to doing this very recently, 2 years ago, there is no replacement for the person who is out there, a woman or a man, who is bringing the real news, not the fake news. Thank you.
Thank you, Ksenia. You mentioned Brezhnev and jokes, and that reminded me that Brezhnev, when he was old and at the end of his career, his PR people tried to hype him up, so they took him on a tour to to a farm, and there's a lot of photographers, etc. And in the afternoon, the guy from the Kremlin calls Pravda and says, I want a big picture of him at his best, vigorous, ready to take on. Okay, the editor goes down to the lab, abroch. What happened? The film is not good. So he calls the Kremlin and says, we thought about maybe writing how good he is. They said, no, you idiot. Picture. So he goes back to the lab and says, please save me. So they found one frame which could work, but it was Brezhnev surrounded by pigs. But the guy says a picture. So they ran, the question was what the byline would be. So somebody came up with a brilliant idea, and the following day Pravda ran with the front page with a picture, and the byline was, Comrade Brezhnev, third from the right. Okay. The Foreign Press Association, FPA, is a respected organization which for many years has been representing the distinguished corps of foreign journalists covering Israel. I'd like to invite Dan Perry, former chairman of the FPA and Middle East editor of the Associated Press. Previously he served as the Europe, Africa editor for AP, Caribbean editor, and Jerusalem bureau chief. Dan, please.
Thank you very much. Good to be here. Good to see everyone. I told Minister Meridor just now that he stole my thunder with so many good points that I'm glad that now being a politician, I will need to use these notes, which will be one distinction and a new thing I can bring to the table. And I think the same can be said of MK Svetlova, I must say, who gave us a very compelling and disturbing list of issues about what's happening in Israel with press freedoms. But that there are press freedom problems should be clear. What's much more striking to me, I think, is how much you have to argue the point with a good proportion of the audience that we're supposed to be serving. That's a more dangerous sign of our times, and it's related, I think, to a lot of the issues that have come up here. It should be clear to anyone that the world needs a responsible and professional filter, and that investigation and reporting and analysis will not just spring up magically from the wisdom of the crowd. In Israel these days, the government certainly has some challenges. The government sends security types to interrogate Palestinian journalists leaving Gaza without any noticeable concern for the dead certainty that this will land them in deep trouble with Hamas militants when they return to the Strip. The government continues, Nitzan, to deny press cards to most Palestinians, even though the army requires them of anyone acting even remotely like a journalist in the territories. We still have a hard-working military censor soldiering on with grim determination, as if unaware that the information posted online does not stop at borders, and a story published in Beirut or Cairo cannot really be prevented from reaching Israel. And there are some other issues that have been touched upon here today. The new broadcasting authority that has become a political fracas. But you know, I have to say, the Israeli press remains impressively dynamic, and I would still say it's free. As a Middle East editor of the Associated Press, I deal with greater outrages than these. We have jihadi fanatics targeting reporters specifically for assassination. You have governments like Syria's limiting access and sending minders to follow us around wherever we go. You have countries where finding out the results of a trial requires close to an investigation. And we have places where contradicting official statements can land you in jail. But here in the Middle East, these are pretty much the usual suspects. Looking at the recently released 2017 World Press Freedom Index by Reporters Without Borders, which I know will be presented here tomorrow in greater detail, what's kind of amazing is the criticism leveled at countries in the West. The US, where the new president has actually declared the press an enemy of the people, came at number 43 out of less than 200. Behind quite a few countries in the developing world that would surprise, I think, many people to see. The UK, I don't know if we have representatives here from there, but it is amazing how hardly any better it does. They come in at number 40, with a report citing insufficient protection for whistleblowers, journalists, and their sources. As for Israel, who supposedly does very well, has a few small problems, I think they came in around number 90. But okay, real dictatorships, North Korea is one thing. But when press abuses happen in democratic countries, in a sense, I have to say, and this may sound a little controversial, they represent the will of the people. I mean, these are democratic countries. Are these things unpopular? Do the people rebel? Where's the million-man march for the freedom of the press? I haven't seen it yet. For my part, I think journalism is just about the most important calling that there is, akin to medicine or education. I believe that not because I'm a journalist. I'm a journalist because I believe that. A little ridiculously, I started off as a computer scientist. I believe this in my heart, which is why I'm here with you today. But if you look at what's been said over the years about our industry, I think you'll find that is not exactly consensus opinion. Yeats, the poet, called journalists the shallowest people on the ridge of the earth. Oscar Wilde said, "Bad manners make a journalist." Bismarck said, "A journalist is a person who has mistaken their calling." And Hemingway called newspaper columnists jackals. Edgar Allan Poe said newspapers exist for the discussion of ephemeral matters in an ephemeral manner, which might actually be true in some cases. It seems these days a lot of people in the audience agree. A Gallup poll found last year that 68% of Americans had little or no trust in the mass media to report the news, quote unquote, fairly accurately and fairly, and I'm pretty sure that you would get a very similar result in Israel today. Does it have to be this way? Maybe not. That same Gallup poll showed that over two-thirds distrusting the press, also showed only 30% felt that way in 1972. Our keynote speaker, Carl Bernstein, might have contributed something to that. Right around then, he was helping to bring down the presidency. And although I was just a kid, from what I can recall, by and large, people seemed to mainly support the journalists. Famous actors played him and his colleague in movies, and in general, journalists were heroes far and wide. I mean, that's another reason why I'm here with you today. Finding a way to rekindle this is not going to be easy, because today we have new complications that some of the previous speakers have talked about. Everyone's a publisher now in a digital environment. There's no end to the voices. some look professional and they're not. Some are professional but don't look that way. Some have agendas that aren't transparent. It isn't clear who the competition is. It isn't obvious even what can legitimately be called the press, which I think MK Svetlova alluded to as well. This blurs the line between freedom of the press and the general freedom of expression, and it creates the suggestion that when we speak of press freedoms in particular, we do so almost as if we're an interest group asking for special favors. It makes sense. I mean, you cannot give everyone on the planet the same access. That's obvious. But if it looks like we're asking for special rights, then we face the question of who appointed us to a special status. And in theory, the market appointed us. And when democracy meets a free market, that's basically the answer. But when so many people in this market would revoke the appointment, this is a precarious and almost absurd position to be in. It's not good for business. And of course, these are times when journalists, their employer's revenue model in some distress, are more concerned than in the past about the business side of things. So much is driven by market concerns and impactfulness and clicks. And that's important. It has to be this way, but there's a cost. People can be made to grow to love ethical and passionate journalism, but it's a bit harder to love a business. It's not likely that as a business, we will move people to joining marches to keep us afloat. Ironically, part of the problem may be that the press is seen by many as part of the establishment that it is meant to keep in check. There are so many disagreements now about basic facts, and the growing inequality has created so much anger at the so-called elites. If the journalists are attached to these elites, and in some cases that is inevitable, and it's kind of the case in many cases here in Israel, it's hard for them to detach from the politics that apply. So, can we get past the uproar over fake news? Can we break through the social media echo chambers and recover a sense of common ground that is essential for trust? Not so easily, that's for sure. But as the world gets more complicated and there is a need for connecting the dots, it's a very fine line between analysis and opinion, and it's easy for people to disagree with those they think crossed that line. And I think that's a very major challenge. I don't know the answer to any of this, but my advice is to simplify, to focus on the essence. I look back on my first AP assignment. It was in Romania. I was sent to Romania, to Bucharest, just weeks after the 1989 revolution. And the Romanians had been through the most awful of dictatorships. And when it was swept away, I recall that the people there needed no convincing about press freedom. There were many problems and mistakes, many conflicts, much trouble back then, but also the freedom, and specifically the press freedom, was a source of an almost magical national joy, a consensus. Journalists were deeply appreciated, and of course they became a little self-important, and some of them became heroes as well. But it was pretty simple. We have lost something of that. When you value something most when you have lost it altogether, better not to lose it. I hope that we can rekindle something of that period that I would say is from 72 to about 1990, without much more damage being done. That would be good for freedom of the press. And as the former journalist Albert Camus once said, without freedom, a press will never be anything but bad. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Dan. And now